Copper Ridge, Montana Territory, 1889. The town sat at the foot of a mountain that blushed the color of hammered copper at every sunset, which was how it earned its name and its reputation both. Beautiful from a distance. Considerably harder than it looked up close. The mountain had given men fortunes and swallowed sons in equal measure over the decades. And most of the people who stayed in Copper Ridge past their first winter had arrived at a quiet understanding that the mountain kept no particular accounting of either fact. Hazel Morrow was 27 years old when that October found her at the window of a rented house on the edge of town, mending a mine foreman's wool jacket by what remained of the afternoon light. The jacket belonged to a man employed by the Consolidated Western Mining Company. The same company that had employed her husband had ruled his death an accident and had quietly arranged for her to no longer be needed at the Copper Ridge schoolhouse 3 weeks after his funeral. She mended the jacket because she needed the coins. She resented the jacket because she needed the coins. She folded both the resentment and the jacket neatly when she was finished, because there was no productive use for either, and she could not afford unproductive things. Her husband's name had been Frederick Morrow. He had been 31 years old when the number 4 shaft collapsed on a Tuesday morning in April. The company ruled it a structural failure consistent with ordinary mine wear. The kind of thing that happened in deep rock. The kind of thing nobody who depended on mining wages was particularly encouraged to examine too closely. Copper Ridge had mourned Frederick properly because he had been genuinely well-liked and had moved on the way small towns do within a season or two. Hazel had not been given the luxury of moving on in quite the same manner. Beckett Yardley was 48 years old, and he ran the only blacksmith shop in Copper Ridge, from a wide, smoke-darkened building at the north end of Main Street, where the road bent toward the mountain. He was a quiet man in the particular way that men who have passed through considerable grief sometimes go quiet. Not bitter, not sealed off, but settled into a steadiness that had been bought at real cost, and was therefore not carelessly spent on things that didn't warrant it. He had come to Montana from Wyoming 3 years prior, following no particular plan except the plain need to be somewhere that his brother's absence didn't live in every familiar corner. His brother James had died in a Pennsylvania coal mine. 11 years before that, at 22 years old, in a collapse the company had also ruled an ordinary accident. Beckett had been 35 then. Old enough to understand what a company ruling was designed to cover, young enough to still be genuinely furious about it. By 48, the fury had settled into something more like careful, permanent attention. He noticed Hazel Morrow the way a man notices someone carrying a weight he himself has carried. The mining company's dismissal of her from the schoolhouse had been the talk of Copper Ridge for the better part of a week. The general consensus being that it was a shameful thing, and the counter-consensus being that nobody in a company town was positioned to say so with much volume. Beckett had heard the story in fragments across his anvil, formed his own understandings of it, and thought more than once about the 27-year-old woman mending other people's laundry in a rented house on a street she had no business renting on. He first stopped at her fence on a Wednesday morning in October, leading a freshly shod horse that needed to be walked a quarter mile before the owner came to collect it. The route he chose for that walk was not the most direct one available, and he was self-aware enough to know it. "Morning," he said. Hazel Morrow looked up from the porch steps where she'd been working a cracked sole back onto a boot with needle and waxed thread. She was 27 years old and presented herself with the particular carefulness of a person who had learned, in recent months, to assess strangers plainly for what they wanted. She assessed him. Then she went back to the boot. "Morning," she said. He moved on. He was 50 yards past her fence before he realized he'd been holding his breath slightly, which was information he filed away without doing much with immediately. He found reasons to walk horses past her fence 4 more times that week on errands that were either genuine or approximately genuine. By the 3rd morning, she'd started watching for him without quite meaning to. By the 5th morning, he stopped at the fence properly, hat in hand, and said, "I make a decent cup of coffee if you ever find yourself needing an excuse not to work for 15 minutes. Hazel looked at him for a long, deliberate moment. She was 27 years old, and she had been a widow for 6 months, and she had learned in those 6 months a considerable amount about the variety of intentions men brought to widows' front fences. "What is it you're after, Mr. Yardley?" she said. She had learned his name the ordinary way. Copper Ridge was not a large town. "Company," Beckett said plainly, without dressing it up. "Not the kind that expects anything back, just the kind that makes a Tuesday morning feel slightly less like one." The honesty of it surprised her enough that she nearly smiled. "Come back tomorrow with that coffee," she said. "We'll see." He came back. He kept coming back. And the 27-year-old woman who had stopped trusting easy things found herself, against her considerable better judgment, beginning to trust the kind of steady presence that arrived every morning without expectation and left, without asking for anything in return. Beckett was 48 years old and had no real talent for smooth conversation, and he understood instinctively that smooth conversation wasn't what Hazel wanted. What she seemed to want was someone who would sit on the porch steps and drink coffee without requiring her to perform gratitude or forward-looking optimism. The things people in difficult circumstances were generally expected to perform for whoever offered them charity. He offered her instead something closer to simple company. He told her once that he had attempted to learn the piano in Wyoming and had abandoned it after 5 months as a mercy to anyone within hearing distance. She told him she had once tried to teach a neighbor's mule to respond to a school bell when she was 14, and her schoolhouse had briefly run short of actual pupils. "Did it work?" he asked. "The mule was more reliably attentive than 2 of the boys I had the following year," she said. He thought about that with considerable warmth for the rest of the afternoon. It was 3 weeks into those morning visits when Hazel said something Beckett could not afterwards set aside. They had found their way, as they usually did, from inconsequential conversation towards something real, and she paused in the middle of a sentence about the school board and looked at the mountain for a long moment. "Frederick had written a letter," she said quietly. "I found it in his coat pocket when I was sorting his things. He'd written it the day before the collapse, addressed to the territorial mine inspector." She wasn't looking at Beckett. She was looking at the mountain. "I didn't understand it properly at the time. I wasn't in a condition to think clearly, but I've had 6 months to think since." Beckett set his coffee cup down. "He'd found something wrong with the number 4 support beam," she continued. "He wrote that it had been deliberately worked on, not worn naturally, not rotted through, but worked on with a tool. He was planning to give the letter to the postal rider the morning after he wrote it." She stopped. The postal rider came. Frederick was already underground by then. The letter was still in his coat when I found him. The 48-year-old blacksmith, who had been 35 years old when he first truly understood what the words "ruled an accident" were designed to cover, turned this information over with the same careful, deliberate attention he gave every piece of iron that came through his shop. "Did you give the letter to the sheriff?" he asked. "The inspector?" "I gave it to Douglas," Hazel said, and something in her voice went carefully still. "Frederick's brother. He told me he'd handle it. He said pursuing the matter would only cause trouble for me. That the company's ruling was already settled. that pushing it would make me appear to be a grieving woman who couldn't accept an ordinary loss. She said the last part the way a person repeats a sentence they've been told. So many times it has worn grooves. And Douglas handled it? Hazel was quiet. I have never seen any evidence that he did. Douglas Morrow was 34 years old and had spent his entire adult quietly aware that his older brother, Frederick, had been the one people remembered, the one who'd married the school teacher, the one who'd filed the land claim on the eastern ridge that the company surveyors had lately been taking an interest in. He appeared at Hazel's door on a Thursday evening, unannounced, and came to the purpose of his visit without much pretense of a social call. "The land claim Frederick filed," he said, standing in her doorway with the particular manner of a man who has rehearsed a conversation enough times that he simply wants it finished. "Without children, without a formal deed transfer, there's a real argument under territorial law that it reverts to blood family rather than a surviving spouse. I'd rather we settle this between family than put you through a court proceeding that's going to reach the same conclusion regardless." Hazel looked at her 34-year-old brother-in-law, who had the expression of a man who had talked himself thoroughly into believing he was extending a kindness. "What did you do with Frederick's letter?" she said. Something moved across Douglas's face and was gone quickly. "I told you at the time it wouldn't have helped anything." "You told me you'd handle it," she said. "I'm asking what that meant." "It meant I made a judgment call on your behalf," he said, the phrase arriving too smoothly for something being said unrehearsed. "The same as I'm trying to do now. Sign the claim over quietly, and I'll see you settled fairly. The company is going to move on that land one way or another. Better you receive something than nothing at all." He left without a signed document, because Hazel didn't sign anything that Thursday evening. She stood in her own doorway a long while after the sound of his horse faded down the road and felt a clarity she had been carefully avoiding for 6 months settle into her chest like cold water. She told Beckett the next morning. The 48-year-old man, who had been listening carefully to her for weeks, heard everything without interrupting, and when she finished, he said, "There's a man named Percy Galt who worked the number 4 shift. He left Consolidated Western's employment 2 weeks after the collapse. He's at a hardware store in Millbrook now. I'd like to go speak with him." "Why would he talk to you?" Hazel asked. "Because I'm not asking him to put anything in writing yet," Beckett said, "just asking what he saw. I want to stop here for just a moment and speak to you directly, if you'll allow me. This story has already traveled further than I imagined when I first sat down with it. I've heard from listeners in Texas and Tennessee, from England and South Africa, from corners of the world I'm still learning the names of. If you're finding some quiet company tonight in Hazel and Beckett, in a woman who kept asking the question everyone else had decided to leave alone, and a man patient enough to walk past the same fence until she was ready to hear an answer, a like goes a long way toward helping Prairie Hearts reach the next person who might need a story like this one. And I would genuinely love to know where you are tonight. Leave a comment, a city, a state, a country, whatever you'd like to share. I read every single one of them, and it still surprises me every time how far an evening like this one travels. Now, back to Copper Ridge. Percy Galt was 43 years old, and he had the face of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had simply been waiting for someone trustworthy to ask him to set it down. He told Beckett what he'd seen, standing behind the hardware store in Millbrook while the afternoon stretched long and cold across the hills. "Coming off my shift at 4 in the morning," Percy said. "Number 4 shaft, eastern section. I saw 2 men working at the main support pillar, the one that failed first when the collapse happened. One man I didn't recognize. The other one I knew." He paused and looked at the ground, then back up. "It was Douglas Morrow, the company's labor liaison. He had every legitimate reason to be in that mine during working hours, but not at 4 in the morning, with a stranger, and a lantern held low enough that nobody was supposed to notice it. Beckett asked whether he had told the sheriff. "I told Douglas," Percy said with the flat, particular exhaustion of a man who understood the full weight of his mistake. The morning after the collapse, before I had thought it through clearly, he told me I was confused from the shock, that I was misremembering, that spreading stories would make everyone's grief harder and do Frederick's widow no kind of good. He looked at Beckett steadily. "I left 2 weeks later because I couldn't look at that mountain anymore. But I held on to what I saw. I held on to it because I didn't know what else to do with it." The 48-year-old blacksmith from Wyoming, who had been 19 years old when his own family first learned what a company ruling was truly built to accomplish, rode back toward Copper Ridge with the particular quiet of a man who has found what he was looking for and wishes it were something easier to carry. He told Hazel that same evening. The lamp between them cast the small room in amber, and outside the mountain had gone dark against a sky still holding the last cold copper light of day. "He knew," Hazel said very quietly, "not a question. Douglas knew what happened to that beam, and he told me to let it go." "He had reason," Beckett said carefully. "The land claim Frederick filed on the Eastern Ridge. If a proper investigation came of this, if a criminal charge followed, any deal he'd made about that land falls apart entirely. Everything." He was quiet a moment. "The urgency he's been showing about getting you to sign that claim over suggests the truth is considerably closer to the surface than he'd like." Hazel sat with that a long while. She was 27 years old and had spent 6 months building a life around the belief that her husband had died by terrible, ordinary bad luck in a dangerous profession. If that wasn't what had happened, if someone had done this deliberately, if the man she'd handed the only evidence to had known exactly what it was and buried it. "How long?" she said. "How long has he known?" "I don't know," Beckett said. "But I think you deserve to know you were never wrong to doubt the story everyone else decided to accept." She looked at him across the lamp. She had been studying people carefully for 6 months, and she knew what she was looking at. "You found this in a single day," she said. "Had a head start," he said. "Already knew what a company ruling is generally designed to cover." "Your brother," Hazel said softly. He nodded. He was 48 years old, and he'd been carrying that knowing for a long time, and it had never become something he could put down entirely. Only something he'd gotten better at distributing across the years without letting it knock him sideways. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry you already knew what to look for." "I'm not," he said, "not tonight." They brought Percy Galt's account to Sheriff Nolan Tate the following week. Beckett's methodical written notes alongside Percy's signed statement, which the 43-year-old hardware store clerk had agreed to provide once. Beckett explained plainly that Percy was no longer the only person who knew what he'd seen. Sheriff Tate was a deliberate man who preferred doing his job correctly over maintaining easy relations with the mining company, and the meeting ended with a letter to the county prosecutor and a wire to the territorial inspector's office. Douglas Morrow was 34 years old when he was brought in for questioning, and he had spent 6 months constructing progressively more comfortable stories about what exactly he had done and precisely why. And those stories served him reasonably well right up until the moment Percy Galt's signed statement was placed flat on the table in front of him. His composure lasted approximately 4 minutes. The truth, once it came, had the raw ugliness of a betrayal built one rationalization at a time. A consolidated Western manager had approached Douglas 8 months before the collapse, offering him a percentage interest in any mineral extraction deal on the Eastern Ridge in exchange for ensuring Frederick's land claim never received formal territorial approval, and ensuring, more urgently, that Frederick never submitted the safety report he'd been compiling. Douglas had arranged for the support pillar to be worked. He had hired a man from out of territory to perform the actual tampering. He had told himself Frederick would be in a different section of the mine when the failure happened, that it would simply delay things, that nobody was truly meant to die. "I didn't know which section he'd be in that morning," Douglas said, in the small county office where Sheriff Tate had him seated. "I want you to understand that. I did not know he would be there." "You tampered with a working mine's support structure," Tate said, with the flat evenness of a man who had heard many explanations and understood what they were worth. "Whatever you believed about where your brother would be standing, you made the choice that killed him." Hazel was waiting outside. Beckett was beside her when Sheriff Tate came through the door. She stood very still in the October afternoon and heard what Douglas had finally said and felt, not rage, not the satisfaction she might have expected after 6 months of unanswered questions, not even simple relief. Something older and quieter, something that had to do with Frederick himself, the actual man. The one who had taught her the name of every peak visible from their kitchen window, who had argued passionately about whether Shakespeare had ever actually seen a mountain, who had stayed 3 nights beside her father's sickbed without ever mentioning it afterward as something requiring acknowledgement. She had not been able to grieve that man properly. She had been too occupied surviving the legal maneuvering and the company pressure and her brother-in-law's careful management of her life. And grief had kept getting pushed to the edge of each day where it waited, unfinished, patient as the mountain. She had room for it now. She wept properly that evening on the steps of the rented house in the cold Montana air, with the mountain dark above the valley and stars scattered thick and sharp across the sky. Beckett sat beside her and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. The same right thing he had been doing every morning for 6 weeks. "He would have loved knowing there was silver under that ridge," she said eventually, her voice rough. "He believed in that land, filed the claim on nothing but faith that it had real value." Something between a laugh and a sob moved through her. "He'd have been absolutely insufferable about being right." "Sounds like someone worth knowing," Beckett said quietly. "He was," Hazel said. "He stopped at broken things. Couldn't walk past something wrong without fixing it. Used to drive me half mad." She pressed the back of her hand against her eyes. "I would give a great deal for one more broken thing he'd stopped to fix." The territorial court confirmed the land claim in Hazel Morrow's name within the month. The subsequent safety inspection, ordered by the territorial inspector following the criminal proceedings against Douglas Morrow, found serious violations in 4 of Consolidated Western's operating shafts and resulted in new safety requirements the companies spent the better part of a year accepting. Percy Galt testified at the inquiry, clearly and steadily, and returned to Millbrook afterward to open his own hardware store within the year. He liked to tell people that he'd finally found work that didn't require him to look the other way, which was a small and honest thing to say, and he meant every word of it. Hazel Morrow, 27 years old, found in those negotiations that 4 years of managing a schoolroom had prepared her exceptionally well to deal with men who assumed they were the most capable person in any given conversation. She insisted on safety provisions in every extraction agreement. She insisted on wages that would allow a mining family to live in Copper Ridge without depending on the company store. The representatives found these terms more agreeable than they had anticipated, partly because Hazel was 27 and polite, and partly because her attorney was neither of those things on her behalf. Beckett watched all of it from the comfortable distance of the forge and the morning fence, and found himself somewhere in the middle of November, needing to be honest with himself about something he had been successfully avoiding for weeks. He stopped walking past her fence for 4 mornings in a row. He told himself he was busy, which was partly true. He told himself she needed space to settle into the new shape of her life, which was also partly true. He told himself that a 48-year-old blacksmith with a small shop and a rented room had no sensible business presenting himself at the fence of a 27-year-old woman who now controlled more wealth than he would see in the remaining years of his working life, and that was the truest part of all. On the 5th morning, he went past anyway. It had become a habit that lived somewhere deeper than decisions. She was waiting at the fence. "You went quiet on me," Hazel said. 4 days. I'd like to know why, if you're willing to say it plainly." Beckett turned his hat in both hands. He was 48 years old, and the feeling he had for this particular woman had become part of how he moved through every ordinary day, and there was no version of explaining that which didn't come down to exactly what it was. "Kept thinking about how it would look," he said. "A man walks past a widow's fence every morning when she's mending other people's coats. That's a neighborly thing. Same man appears the week after she's confirmed the most valuable land claim in the county." He stopped. "I don't want to be that story. I've never wanted to be that story." Hazel looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. "You went to Millbrook in a single day," she said. "You sat beside me on these steps while I cried for my husband and said exactly nothing, because nothing was exactly the right thing. You walked past this fence every morning for 6 weeks when I had nothing to offer you but a cracked boot and a thoroughly unpleasant disposition." She folded her arms. The silver was always in that ground. Frederick filed the claim before he died. The land was always there. The only thing that has changed is that I know about it now. And the only thing that has changed about you is that you've had 4 days to talk yourself out of something you have no reason whatsoever to doubt. He was quiet a moment. "You're 27, he said. "I'm 48. "I am a former school teacher," she said, with a precision that was only slightly forgiving. "I can do arithmetic." The corner of her mouth moved towards something that was almost a smile. "I would also like to point out that a man who walked past a fence every morning at 48 years old has already demonstrated more patience and more plain decency than most men I have encountered at any age. The number does not particularly concern me if it does not concern you." He asked her properly 2 weeks later, on a morning when the first real snowfall had come down from the mountain overnight and left everything white and quietly remade. He had spent those 2 weeks considering how to say it, and in the end chose the simplest version, because Hazel had always preferred the simplest true thing to any elaborately constructed substitute for it. "I can't offer you much that impresses anyone," he said, standing at the fence where their whole story had started. "I have the forge, a rented room, and 48 years of knowing exactly which things I care about and which ones I don't. But I've been walking past your fence since October, and I think you know by now I'm not going to stop unless you ask me to." He looked at her steadily, with the eyes of a man who had been patient long enough that patience had become simply who he was. "I'd rather ask plainly than wonder the rest of my life what you'd have said." Hazel Morrow stood in the new snow at the fence where they had first spoken, 27 years old, and looked at the 48-year-old man who had walked past her door every morning without asking anything from her except honesty. "Yes," she said. She reached across the fence and took his weathered hands in both of hers. "Beckett Yardley, yes, though I want you to understand something first." She held his hands and looked at him directly in the same clear way she had assessed him that very first Wednesday morning when she'd been checking for danger and found something she didn't have a ready category for. "I am not marrying you because you helped me. I am marrying you because you sat beside me in the dark and didn't try to fix it. Because you told me the truth when it was terrible. Because you are 48 years old and you still stop at a broken fence instead of riding past it." She held his hands tighter once. "And because you make a genuinely excellent cup of coffee, which is not a small thing when a person has had a very long year." They married that December in the Copper Ridge Church, in the first deep cold of the Montana winter, with snow falling soft and steady outside the tall windows and the whole town filling every pew. Sheriff Nolan Tate was there. Percy Galt rode up from Millbrook. Even 2 of the school board members came, though they spent most of the ceremony studying the floor, which was a penance of a kind. The eastern ridge caught the pale winter light above the rooftops, the way it always did, indifferent and magnificent, the same as it had been on every other day the town had ever lived through. Hazel used a portion of the land agreement's first proceeds to fund an independent mine inspection program for the territory, something the territorial government had intended to establish for years without ever quite locating the money. Frederick had written his letter because he believed someone with authority ought to know what was happening underground. Hazel made sure in the years that followed that there would always be someone whose job it was to look, and look honestly, regardless of what the company preferred. Beckett sold his rented room and moved the forge to the Morrow property, where there was more space and better light and a fence he no longer approached from the outside. He was fond of saying, when people asked how he'd ended up where he had, that he'd gotten a considerably better arrangement than the one he'd offered. Hazel disputed this regularly and on principle, on the grounds that she had done the arithmetic and found it entirely fair. They carried this particular argument, in various forms, for the better part of 30 years, and neither of them ever quite won it, which suited both of them completely. Some mornings when the light came down gold and long across the eastern ridge, the way mountain light does at that hour, as though it is still deciding whether to arrive, Beckett would find Hazel at the kitchen window with her coffee, watching the high country the way a person watches something they have made a repeat peace with. He never disturbed those mornings. He understood what they were, the kind that belong only to someone who has earned the right to stand at that particular window and look out at that particular ridge and feel. Not happiness exactly, not grief exactly, but something older and fuller than either. Something that takes a certain loss to understand, a certain patience to grow toward, and a certain ordinary, steady love to finally have room for. There is a kind of courage, I've come to believe, in asking a question you're genuinely afraid of the answer to. Hazel Morrow had every reason to leave the letter in Frederick's coat and call it grief and move on. Most people, I suspect, would have. It is easier, most days, to accept the comfortable shape of a painful story than to risk discovering the comfortable shape was a lie that someone else constructed for their own purposes. It took a 48-year-old man walking past a fence, morning after morning, with nothing more to offer than coffee and plain company, before she found the courage to ask the question out loud instead of simply carrying the doubt alone. And he, for his part, had to find his nerve twice, once to stop at her fence when she had nothing, and once again to stay at it when she had everything. Proof, maybe, that patience is not a single act a person performs once and finishes with, but something they keep choosing, morning after morning, fence line after fence line, for as long as it matters. Thank you for spending this evening with us out here in Copper Ridge. Wherever you are tonight, whatever weight you're carrying, whatever question you've been afraid to ask, I hope this story found you at the right moment. May God bless you and keep you. And until the next story finds its way to you, keep writing.